The news of Duke Edward Pembroke of Northcrest's sudden passing swept through London's elite circles like wildfire on a particularly dry summer day, leaving in its wake a flurry of speculation and whispered gossip behind ornate fans and beside polished marble columns. The grand ballroom of Pembroke House stood transformed into a sombre gathering place, the crystal chandeliers dimmed in respect for the occasion, as solicitor Mr. Atticus Fleming adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat, preparing to read the final testament of one of England's most influential noblemen. Lady Charlotte Pembroke, the Duke's youngest child and only daughter, stood quietly in the shadows at the back of the room, her plain black mourning dress lacking the expensive embellishments that adorned her sisters-in-law, particularly the ever-preening Lady Sophia, who sat prominently beside Charlotte's eldest brother Frederick, her jewelled fingers possessively entwined with his, as if already claiming what was sure to come their way. Charlotte kept her gaze fixed on the polished floor, avoiding the pitying glances cast her way. The forgotten daughter, the plain one, the girl whose only virtue in society's eyes was her connection to the Pembroke name, a connection that seemed tenuous at best as the reading of the will was about to commence. I'm so glad you're here with me today, dear listener, for what is about to unfold is a tale of legacy beyond gold and silver, of worth beyond what can be counted in pounds and pence, and of a heart that understood value far deeper than the shallow pools in which society often wades. For while the Duke's sons Frederick and Thomas leaned forward eagerly as the solicitor broke the wax seal on the document, their eyes gleaming with anticipated riches, none suspected the true nature of the legacy that Edward Pembroke had crafted, nor how it would upend every expectation in the coming weeks, particularly for the daughter who had always lived in the shadows of her brother's grandeur. The collective gasp that filled the room when Mr. Fleming read the distribution of assets was nothing compared to the stunned silence that followed. The Duke had indeed left his vast fortune and lands divided between his two sons, the sprawling country estate of Northcrest, to Frederick, along with the majority of the family's business investments, and to Thomas the London townhouse and several properties throughout the countryside, leaving his daughter with nothing but a modest annual allowance and a small cottage on the edge of what was now her brother's property. Lady Sophia's triumphant smile cut across her porcelain features like a knife wound as she squeezed her husband's hand, while Thomas nodded with satisfaction, both brothers pointedly avoiding looking in their sister's direction as if her mere presence might somehow diminish their newfound wealth. Yet it was the final paragraph of the will that caused the greatest stir, as Mr. Fleming adjusted his spectacles once more and announced in his reedy voice that the Duke had appointed not a family member, but his longtime friend, the notoriously private and formidable Marquis of Ravenwood, Lord Nathaniel Sinclair, as executor of the estate and guardian of the Pembroke name and reputation. The solicitor further stated that a private letter addressed to Lady Charlotte was to be delivered directly to her hands, and that Lord Ravenwood himself would be arriving within the fortnight to oversee the transition of power and ensure the Duke's final wishes were honoured in full. At this pronouncement, Frederick's face darkened with barely contained fury, his knuckles whitening around the edge of his chair, while Thomas muttered something under his breath that made the elderly dowager beside him gasp and shift away. Charlotte felt the weight of every eye in the room as she accepted the sealed letter from Mr. Fleming with trembling fingers, her mind racing with confusion and hurt, even as she maintained the composed exterior her father had always praised her for. Why had he left her so little, when he had always shown her such affection in private? What could possibly be contained in this letter that required such secrecy? And who was this Lord Ravenwood truly, a man she had heard mentioned only in hushed tones around her father's study, a man whose reputation for cold calculation and unwavering principles made him both respected and feared throughout London society? As the gathering dispersed into clusters of excited chatter, Charlotte slipped away unnoticed, clutching her father's letter against her heart as she made her way to the small rose garden where she had spent countless hours with him, learning about the family history, the meaning of honour, and the responsibility that came with the Pembroke name, lessons her brothers had always been too busy, too important to attend. Little did she know that the contents of that letter would set her on a collision course with her brother's ambitions, with society's expectations, and with the enigmatic Lord Ravenwood himself, forever altering the course of the legacy her father had so carefully planted, like the roses they had tended together, thorns and all. 5 years before the fateful reading of his will, Duke Edward Pembroke had begun to see his sons for what they truly were. Frederick, the eldest, had evolved from a boisterous youth into a calculating man whose every action seemed measured against potential profit, his marriage to the socially ambitious Lady Sophia cementing his position as a rising power in London's elite circles. Thomas, only 2 years younger, had developed a reputation for reckless gambling and scandalous liaisons, kept barely in check by his father's influence and perpetually replenished allowance. It was during this period of increasing disillusionment with his sons that the Duke began to spend more time with his daughter Charlotte, the child whose birth had claimed her mother's life 18 years prior, a tragedy for which her brothers had always subtly, cruelly blamed her. In Charlotte, the Duke discovered something his sons lacked entirely, a genuine interest in the Pembroke legacy beyond its monetary value. During long afternoons in his library, Edward shared family histories, teaching Charlotte about the generations of Pembrokes who had served crown and country with distinction, who had built not just wealth, but respect. Charlotte absorbed these lessons with quiet eagerness, her intelligent eyes brightening when her father revealed ancient family documents or explained the meaning behind the family crest. These moments were precious islands of belonging in Charlotte's otherwise lonely existence, standing in stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she received from her brothers and their social circle, who viewed her as merely the plain, awkward daughter of Northcrest, a girl with neither exceptional beauty nor substantial dowry to recommend her. The relationship between father and daughter had deepened further when Charlotte discovered her father slumped in his study one evening, clutching his chest, face ashen with pain. Rather than calling for servants immediately, she had calmly helped him to his chair, administered his physician's prescribed medication, and stayed by his side until the episode passed. From that night forward, Edward confided in Charlotte about his weakening heart condition, swearing her to secrecy even from her brothers, who he feared would begin positioning themselves for power prematurely if they knew the truth. It was also after this incident that the Duke began corresponding regularly with Lord Nathaniel Sinclair, the Marquess of Ravenwood, a man whose unimpeachable integrity and sharp mind had impressed Edward during their years serving together on various governmental committees. What neither Frederick nor Thomas knew, what none of London society suspected, was that during these final years, the Duke had been quietly restructuring certain aspects of the Pembroke holdings, placing specific investments, documents, and family heirlooms beyond the direct control of the dukedom itself. Charlotte had witnessed her father's meticulous work without fully understanding its purpose, assuming it was simply part of the estate management he was teaching her. When she occasionally asked about Lord Ravenwood, her father would simply smile enigmatically and say, "He is a man who understands the value of a name, my dear, and the weight of carrying it properly." A comment that meant little to Charlotte at the time, but would return to her with startling clarity in the days following her father's death. The morning after the will reading, Charlotte sat alone in her childhood bedroom, the seal on her father's letter finally broken, tears streaming down her face as she read his elegant script, explaining what he could not say publicly, that he had seen the corruption growing in his sons' hearts, that he feared what would become of the Pembroke name under their stewardship, and that he had entrusted certain crucial elements of their legacy to Lord Ravenwood's protection until such time as Charlotte might claim them, not through legal maneuvering or social manipulation, as her brothers would attempt, but by proving herself worthy of the true Pembroke inheritance, their honor, their principles, and the responsibility to use privilege for purpose beyond self-interest. Within 3 days of the will reading, the reality of Charlotte's new position within the family became painfully apparent. Frederick and his wife Sophia had wasted no time in asserting their authority over Northcrest, directing servants to relocate Charlotte's belongings to the small stone cottage at the edge of the property, a building previously used to house visiting groundskeepers, now hastily prepared as her new residence. Charlotte endured the indignity with outward composure, even as Sophia made pointed comments about charitable arrangements and family obligation within earshot. The cottage, though clean and structurally sound, was a far cry from the opulence of the main house where Charlotte had spent her entire life. Yet as she arranged her modest possessions in the small sitting room, Charlotte felt an unexpected sense of freedom beneath her grief. These walls, at least, would not echo with her brother's condescension or Sophia's thinly veiled insults. Here, surrounded by the few treasured books her father had specifically bequeathed to her, and accompanied only by her loyal lady's maid Elizabeth Reed, Charlotte could finally breathe without measuring each inhalation against society's restrictive expectations. The arrival of Lord Nathaniel Sinclair at Northcrest a week later sent ripples of tension throughout the estate. The Marquis of Ravenwood cut an imposing figure as he rode through the gates, his tall frame straight-backed in the saddle, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts as he surveyed the property. At 35, Lord Sinclair had built a reputation as a formidable presence in both Parliament and society, his penetrating intelligence and unyielding principles earning him respect even from those who found him intimidatingly austere. Unmarried despite being one of England's most eligible bachelors, rumours swirled about a tragic love affair in his youth that had left him cold to the possibility of marriage. Rumours he neither confirmed nor denied, maintaining a private life as carefully guarded as his substantial estates. Charlotte observed his arrival from the cottage window, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread, her father's letter carefully folded in her pocket as a talisman against the uncertainty that stretched before her. The first formal meeting between Lord Sinclair and the Pembroke siblings took place in what was now Frederick's study, the very room where Charlotte had spent countless hours with her father, now transformed by the removal of beloved books and the addition of ostentatious decorative items clearly selected by Sophia to display the family's wealth. Frederick had positioned himself behind the massive oak desk, a transparent attempt to establish dominance in the encounter, while Thomas lounged with affected casualness near the fireplace, occasionally checking his reflection in the ornate mirror above the mantel. Charlotte had been seated at the farthest edge of the gathering, a physical manifestation of her reduced status within the family. Yet she found herself directly in Lord Sinclair's line of sight as he systematically outlined the responsibilities of his executorship and the conditions that had been established by the late Duke regarding the management of the estate. The Marquis spoke with precision and authority, his deep voice carrying an undercurrent of command that seemed to fill the room despite his measured tone. He addressed each sibling with formal correctness, yet Charlotte could not help but notice the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tightening around his eyes when Frederick interrupted with questions about access to certain investment accounts, the barely perceptible downward turn of his mouth when Thomas inquired about advancing funds against future quarterly allowances. When those steel-grey eyes finally turned fully to Charlotte, she felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not of the man himself, whom she had never met before, but of something in his gaze that reminded her powerfully of her father's most thoughtful moments. Lord Sinclair asked her a single, seemingly simple question about her comfort in her new accommodations, yet the genuine attention with which he awaited her response stood in stark contrast to her brother's dismissive impatience throughout the meeting. That evening, as Charlotte recorded the day's events in her journal by candlelight, she found herself returning repeatedly to the moment Lord Sinclair had departed, when he had handed each sibling a sealed document containing individualized instructions from their father. Frederick and Thomas had immediately retired to separate rooms to examine their letters, but the Marquis had lingered briefly after presenting Charlotte with hers, stating quietly that he would call upon her at the cottage the following afternoon, as there were matters of particular importance they must discuss privately. The formal words had been unremarkable, yet something in his tone, a subtle emphasis that only someone attuned to nuance might detect, had sent a whisper of hope through Charlotte's heart. A fragile suggestion that perhaps her father's cryptic letter had indeed laid the groundwork for something beyond the apparent abandonment she had suffered in his will. Lord Nathaniel Sinclair arrived at Charlotte's cottage precisely at the appointed hour the following day, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun as he ducked slightly to enter the modest doorway. Charlotte had spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, directing Elizabeth to help arrange the small sitting room as presentably as possible, brewing fresh tea from her limited supplies, and changing her dress twice before settling on a simple but dignified blue gown that had been one of her father's favorites. The Marquess declined refreshment with polite brevity, his observant gaze taking in the cottage's sparse furnishings and Charlotte's attempts to create an atmosphere of genteel comfort despite her reduced circumstances. When they were finally seated across from one another, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Charlotte, summoning her courage, directly addressed the purpose of his visit. It was then that Lord Sinclair's carefully maintained formal demeanour softened almost imperceptibly, and he withdrew from his coat a small brass key that glinted in the light streaming through the cottage windows. "Your father entrusted this to me," he explained, his deep voice pitched low as if sharing a confidence, along with explicit instructions that I should determine the appropriate moment to present it to you. The key, he continued, opened a hidden compartment in the Duke's personal desk, a desk that had been specifically excluded from the estate inventory and relocated to Lord Sinclair's London residence for safekeeping prior to the Duke's death. Charlotte listened with growing astonishment as the Marquess revealed that her father had spent the final years of his life secretly documenting discrepancies in the estate's finances, discrepancies that pointed to a disturbing pattern of misappropriation and fraudulent dealings orchestrated by none other than Frederick, with Thomas's complicit knowledge. These records, along with other crucial family documents, had been preserved by the Duke as evidence that his sons had been systematically undermining the Pembroke legacy, using the family's reputation and connections to facilitate business ventures that ranged from ethically questionable to potentially criminal. Lord Sinclair's expression remained carefully neutral as he outlined the situation, yet Charlotte detected a flash of something like admiration in his eyes when she responded not with histrionic shock, but with thoughtful questions about the implications for innocent parties connected to these dealings. The Marquess explained that Edward Pembroke had crafted his will specifically to appear as though he had favoured his sons with the bulk of the inheritance, knowing their greed would prevent them from looking deeper into the conditions attached to their newfound authority. In reality, he had structured a complex legal framework that would ultimately allow the fraudulent activities to be exposed without destroying the Pembroke name entirely, but only if someone with both the family connection and moral integrity stepped forward to address the corruption at precisely the right moment. That person, her father had determined, could only be Charlotte. "Your father spoke of you often during our private meetings," Lord Sinclair said, a new warmth colouring his typically reserved tone as he described how the Duke had observed Charlotte's character developing over the years, how he had tested her understanding of honour and responsibility through their conversations, and how he had ultimately concluded that she alone could be trusted with the true Pembroke legacy. The Marquess's voice took on an unusual quality as he recounted Edward's description of his daughter, a blend of respect and something more personal that caused Charlotte to look up from her clasped hands to find his penetrating gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that made her heart quicken inexplicably. In that moment of shared understanding, the formal distance between them seemed to diminish, revealing a connection forged through their mutual admiration for the man who had brought them together across the social divide that would normally have kept them in entirely separate spheres. The gravity of what lay before her settled over Charlotte like a mantle, as Lord Sinclair outlined what would be required. She would need to temporarily leave Northcrest, taking up residence in a modest but respectable apartment in London that the Duke had arranged for her prior to his death. There, under Lord Sinclair's guidance and protection, she would begin the delicate process of reviewing the evidence, consulting discreetly with solicitors, and preparing for the moment when the truth would need to be revealed publicly. "It will not be easy," the Marquess cautioned, his expression grave as he detailed the opposition she would face, the social censure that might come from challenging her brothers, the whispered accusations of jealousy or madness that society would inevitably craft to explain a sister turning against her siblings. "Your father believed you possessed the strength for this task," Lord Sinclair concluded, rising to his impressive height as he prepared to depart, leaving the key in Charlotte's trembling palm. "Having met you at last, I find I share his conviction." With those words hanging in the air between them, he bowed formally over her hand, yet held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly demanded, a silent acknowledgement of the unlikely alliance they had just formed and the challenging path that stretched before them. The following fortnight passed in a whirlwind of clandestine activity as Charlotte prepared for her departure from Northcrest. She told her brothers she had decided to accept an invitation from their father's elderly cousin in Bath, a plausible excuse that elicited little more than dismissive relief from Frederick and Thomas, both of whom seemed eager to be unburdened of her presence as they settled more firmly into their inherited positions. Elizabeth Reed, the only servant truly loyal to Charlotte, quietly packed the few meaningful possessions they would take to London, while Lord Sinclair arranged for the discreet transportation that would carry them to the modest but respectable apartment in a genteel area of the city. Charlotte felt a strange mixture of trepidation and exhilaration as she bid a silent farewell to her childhood home, casting one last glance at the Rose Garden, where she and her father had shared so many meaningful conversations before stepping into the unmarked carriage that waited in the pre-dawn darkness, curtains drawn to conceal her identity from curious eyes. The London apartment, though small by aristocratic standards, offered Charlotte an unexpected sense of independence she had never experienced under her brother's watchful scrutiny. Located on a quiet street near Bedford Square, the rooms had been furnished simply, but with careful attention to comfort and functionality, including a study equipped with a writing desk, adequate lighting, and bookshelves stocked with volumes on law, finance, and family histories, all resources that would prove invaluable in the weeks to come. Lord Sinclair called upon her the day after her arrival, bringing with him the Duke's personal desk that had been mentioned during their conversation at the cottage. Together, they used the brass key to unlock its hidden compartment, revealing a collection of leather-bound journals, financial ledgers, and correspondence that represented years of Edward Pembroke's meticulous documentation. As they spread the materials across the study table, Charlotte felt her father's presence almost tangibly in the room, guiding her fingers as she traced his elegant handwriting, detailing the first suspicious transaction Frederick had orchestrated using the family name almost 7 years earlier. The pattern that emerged from the Duke's records was more disturbing than Charlotte had initially imagined. Her brothers had not simply misappropriated family funds for personal extravagance, though there was ample evidence of that as well, but had systematically used the Pembroke name and connections to lure unsuspecting investors into schemes that were designed to fail after the brothers had extracted their profits. Several prominent families had been financially devastated by these ventures, their losses carefully concealed behind legal maneuvering and social pressure to avoid scandal. Most alarming was evidence suggesting that Frederick and Thomas had begun targeting vulnerable widows with substantial inheritances but limited financial knowledge, presenting them with investment opportunities that appeared legitimate due to the Pembroke Association, but were little more than elaborate frauds. The Duke's notes revealed his growing horror as he discovered the extent of his son's moral corruption, along with his determination to address it without destroying innocent lives caught in the web his children had woven. Charlotte spent long days analyzing documents and making careful notes, often working late into the night until her eyes burned with fatigue. Lord Sinclair visited regularly, bringing additional records from his own investigations and connecting Charlotte with trusted solicitors who could advise on the legal implications of what they were uncovering. During these consultations, Charlotte observed a subtle shift in the Marquis's demeanor toward her, a growing respect evident in the way he increasingly sought her opinions, considered her suggestions, and occasionally deferred to her insights regarding her brother's motivations or methods. This evolving partnership revealed dimensions of Lord Sinclair's character that contradicted his public reputation for cold detachment. In private conversations, Charlotte discovered his dry wit, his passionate commitment to justice, and most surprisingly, his capacity for genuine empathy when discussing the potential impact of their actions on innocent parties connected to the Pembroke affairs. One evening, after a particularly productive session reviewing evidence, he shared with unexpected candor how her father had helped him navigate his own family tragedy years earlier, offering guidance that had prevented him from becoming bitter despite his losses. A revelation that created a new layer of understanding between them and explained his unwavering loyalty to Edward Pembroke's final wishes. As weeks turned into months, Charlotte's confidence grew alongside her understanding of the complex financial and social web her brothers had woven. She transformed from a sheltered young woman into a formidable advocate for the true Pembroke legacy. her natural intelligence sharpened by necessity and guided by both her father's written wisdom and Lord Sinclair's worldly experience. The Marquis, for his part, found himself increasingly impressed by Charlotte's resilience and integrity, often staying later than intended during their meetings, their conversations gradually expanding beyond the investigation to include literature, philosophy, and shared observations about the hypocrisies of London society. Neither acknowledged openly the subtle warming between them, the lingering glances, the unconscious tendency to sit closer together as they reviewed documents, the way his hand sometimes remained supporting her elbow a moment longer than necessary when helping her with cumbersome ledgers. Yet both recognized that something unexpected was developing alongside their professional alliance, something that would eventually demand acknowledgement. In their more pressing concerns were resolved. The annual Harrington Ball, hosted by the Earl and Countess of Westfield, marked the pinnacle of the London social season, an event where reputations were made or destroyed with a single invitation or subtle snub. Charlotte had received her invitation through Lord Sinclair's careful manoeuvring, a strategic necessity as they approached the culmination of their months-long investigation. Frederick and Sophia had been firmly established as fixtures in society since inheriting the bulk of the Pembroke fortune, their newfound wealth opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed to them despite their aristocratic lineage. Thomas, too, had leveraged his inheritance to elevate his position, courting the daughter of a wealthy merchant whose substantial dowry would further line his perpetually depleted pockets. Neither brother suspected their estranged sister's presence in London, much less the damning evidence she had compiled against them, making the Harrington Ball the perfect stage for the carefully orchestrated confrontation that Lord Sinclair and Charlotte had been meticulously planning for weeks. Charlotte felt a flutter of nerves as her modest carriage joined the elegant procession approaching the Westfield mansion, its windows ablaze with light that spilled onto the street in golden pools, illuminating the fashionable crowd making their way up the marble steps. Her gown, though not the most elaborate or expensive in attendance, had been chosen with particular care, a deep burgundy silk that complemented her fair complexion and brought out auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, its classic lines emphasizing her natural grace rather than attempting to mimic the more ostentatious styles favored by women like her sister-in-law. Elizabeth had arranged Charlotte's hair in a simple but elegant style, accented only by a single pearl hairpin that had belonged to her mother, a subtle statement of legitimacy and heritage that would not be lost on careful observers. Lord Sinclair would arrive separately to avoid raising suspicions, though they had agreed upon a precise sequence of events that would unfold once both were present within the ballroom, a choreography as deliberate as any dance that would take place that evening. The Countess of Westfield's surprised expression upon announcing Lady Charlotte Pembroke sent an immediate ripple through the assembled guests, heads turning and whispers erupting as Charlotte made her way into the ballroom with carefully practiced composure. She caught sight of Frederick nearly dropping his champagne glass in shock, his face darkening with anger, as he whispered urgently to Sophia, whose perfectly painted features contorted briefly before settling into a mask of brittle civility. Thomas, already half intoxicated despite the early hour, stared openly with confusion etched across his face, clearly struggling to comprehend his sister's unexpected appearance in a social circle he had assumed was now closed to her. Charlotte acknowledged various acquaintances with dignified nods as she moved through the crowd, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman and positioning herself strategically near a cluster of influential matrons whose gossip would ensure that every detail of the evening's events would spread through London by morning. Lord Nathaniel Sinclair's arrival 15 minutes later caused its own stir among the guests. His imposing presence and notorious selectivity about social engagements making his attendance noteworthy even without the drama unfolding around the Pembroke siblings. Charlotte observed from her position how several hopeful mothers subtly maneuvered their eligible daughters into his path, how his polite but distant acknowledgements discouraged without explicitly rebuffing their attentions, how his penetrating gaze swept the room until it found hers across the crowded space. The moment their eyes met carried a weight of shared purpose that sent a shiver of anticipation down Charlotte's spine, a silent confirmation that the careful plans they had constructed during long evenings in her modest study were now irreversibly in motion. When Lord Sinclair began making his way deliberately toward her, the crowd parted almost unconsciously before him, creating a visible pathway that drew all eyes to their impending interaction, including those of Frederick, who had been attempting to intercept his sister since her arrival, but had been repeatedly delayed by strategic interruptions from the Marquis's allies strategically placed throughout the ballroom. The orchestra had just begun a new set when Lord Sinclair reached Charlotte's side, bowing formally over her gloved hand as protocol demanded, while murmuring words meant only for her ears. "Everything is in place." The solicitor arrived with the documents moments ago. His eyes held hers with unwavering intensity as he straightened to his full impressive height, then turned slightly to face the approaching Frederick, whose forced smile did nothing to disguise the fury in his eyes as he inserted himself into their conversation with barely maintained propriety. "Lord Sinclair, what an unexpected pleasure," Frederick began, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone as he pointedly ignored his sister's presence. "I wonder if I might have a private word regarding certain estate matters." The Marquis's response was delivered with glacial courtesy, yet loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "Actually, Lord Pembroke, I believe the time has come for a rather more public discussion of the Pembroke estate, one that your father would have considered long overdue." With those words, the careful machinations of the past months crystallized into this pivotal moment, and Charlotte straightened her spine, ready at last to fight for the true legacy her father had entrusted to her care. Frederick's face drained of color at Lord Sinclair's words, his practiced social mask slipping momentarily to reveal naked alarm before he recovered enough to attempt damage control. "Surely any business matters can wait for a more appropriate setting," he insisted, lowering his voice and glancing nervously at the curious onlookers who had begun to gather at the edges of their conversation, drawn by the palpable tension radiating between the three figures. Charlotte observed her brother's discomfort with a strange calm, months of preparation steadying her nerves as she watched Lord Sinclair shake his head with deliberate finality. "I'm afraid this particular matter has waited long enough," the Marquis replied, his commanding voice carrying easily through the now hushed section of the ballroom. With a subtle gesture, he summoned a distinguished grey-haired gentleman who had been waiting discreetly nearby. Mr. Whitford, the family's former solicitor whom Frederick had dismissed shortly after inheriting the estate, replaced with a more malleable legal mind, willing to overlook questionable transactions. Frederick's complexion shifted from pallid to mottled red as he recognized the solicitor, particularly when he noted the leather portfolio tucked under the man's arm, bearing the distinctive Pembroke seal. By this time, Thomas had joined the growing scene, swaying slightly as he positioned himself beside Frederick with an expression of confused belligerence, while Sophia hovered at the periphery, her calculating eyes darting between the faces of those assembled as she attempted to gauge the severity of the threat unfolding before her. Lord Sinclair's next actions demonstrated the strategic brilliance that had earned him his formidable reputation in both political and social circles. Rather than confronting the brothers directly, he turned to address the gathered crowd with respectful gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I beg your indulgence for what may seem an unconventional interruption to this splendid evening," he began, his resonant voice commanding immediate attention. "As many of you know, I had the honor of serving as the late Duke of Northcrest's closest friend and confidant during his final years, and it was his explicit wish that certain matters regarding the Pembroke legacy be addressed in the presence of those who held his family in esteem." The elegant gathering shifted with collective interest, social predators sensing the approach of scandal with gleeful anticipation, while Frederick made one last desperate attempt to intervene, only to be silenced by a quelling look from their hostess, the Countess of Westfield, who had moved to stand symbolically beside Lord Sinclair in a clear indication of her support. What followed was a masterfully orchestrated revelation that neither accused nor condemned directly, yet systematically dismantled the false narrative Frederick and Thomas had constructed since their father's death. Mr. Whitford presented documented evidence of the brothers' systematic abuse of the Pembroke name and resources, evidence that had been meticulously gathered by the Duke himself before his death and supplemented by Charlotte's recent investigations. With each new disclosure, gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, particularly when Lord Sinclair named specific families present who had unknowingly fallen victim to the brothers' schemes, including the elderly Lady Winters, whose substantial losses had forced her to withdraw her granddaughter from finishing school and reduce her household staff to a skeletal minimum. Throughout this calculated exposure, Charlotte remained composed at Lord Sinclair's side, her quiet dignity providing a stark contrast to her brother's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit the accusations, their protestations growing more incoherent as the weight of evidence mounted incontrovertibly against them. The pivotal moment arrived when Lord Sinclair produced the final document from Mr. Whitford's portfolio, a codicil to the Duke's will that had been legally executed, but deliberately withheld until this precise moment. Edward Pembroke anticipated his son's actions with remarkable accuracy, the Marquess stated, his voice softening as he turned to Charlotte with unmistakable respect. He structured his will to test their character, knowing that if they behaved as he feared they would, this contingency would be activated. The codicil, read aloud by Mr. Whitford to the now completely silent ballroom, revealed the Duke's true intentions. Should his sons abuse their inheritance in specified ways they had indeed pursued with alarming precision, control of the Pembroke holdings would transfer to his daughter Charlotte, with Lord Sinclair serving as trustee until the legal proceedings were completed. Frederick's face contorted with fury as the full implications became clear, while Thomas seemed to deflate entirely, slumping against a nearby column as the foundation of his extravagant lifestyle crumbled before his eyes. Sophia, ever the pragmatist, had already begun edging away from her husband's side, her quick mind calculating the social ramifications of remaining tethered to a falling star. "Lady Charlotte Pembroke," Lord Sinclair proclaimed, turning fully toward her now, his formal address underscored by something warmer in his gaze that caused her heart to quicken, "has demonstrated the integrity, wisdom, and devotion to family honor that her father always saw in her. While pursuing justice, she has consistently prioritized minimizing harm to innocent parties affected by her brother's actions, designing a restructuring plan that will provide restitution to those who have suffered losses while preserving what is worthy in the Pembroke legacy." As Lord Sinclair extended his hand to Charlotte in a gesture that symbolically transferred power back to its rightful heir, she stepped forward with quiet confidence, accepting both his support and the heavy responsibility it represented. The assembled aristocracy, always appreciative of a dramatic reversal of fortune when it didn't affect their own interests, began to murmur with approval, particularly when several respected elder peers moved forward to express their support for the Duke's posthumous decision, effectively sealing the social validation that would be critical for Charlotte's position in the coming months. In the tumultuous hour that followed the public revelation, Charlotte found herself at the center of a transformed social landscape, receiving expressions of support from influential figures who had previously overlooked her entirely. The Countess of Westfield had personally escorted her to a private sitting room adjacent to the ballroom, allowing her a brief respite from the overwhelming attention while the initial shockwaves rippled through London society. Frederick and Thomas had been firmly but discreetly removed from the premises by the Earl's security staff when their protests threatened to become disruptive, while Sophia had executed a remarkable social pivot, loudly lamenting to anyone who would listen how she had been deceived by her husband's character and had harbored suspicions that she had been tragically unable to confirm until this evening's revelations. Charlotte observed these rapid realignments with a clear-eyed understanding of their self-interested nature, yet found herself unexpectedly moved by the genuine expressions of admiration from several older peers who had known her father well and recognized in her the qualities they had respected in him. Lord Sinclair joined her in the sitting room after ensuring that all legal matters had been properly handled, his normally stern features softened by something resembling satisfaction as he closed the door behind him, momentarily shielding them both from the curious gazes and eager questions that awaited outside. "You conducted yourself with remarkable poise," he said, remaining standing despite the available seating, his tall figure silhouetted against the ornate wallpaper, as he studied her with an intensity that might have been discomforting had they not developed such trust over the preceding months. Charlotte rose to face him, suddenly acutely aware of the private nature of their conversation after the public drama they had orchestrated together. "I had an exemplary guide," she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected given the emotional magnitude of the evening. Something shifted in Lord Sinclair's expression at her words, a subtle transformation that went beyond professional approval or respectful admiration, revealing a personal investment that had grown alongside their shared mission. The silence between them hummed with unspoken recognition, with the acknowledgement of how their alliance had evolved into something neither had anticipated when first brought together by Edward Pembroke's final wishes. "Your father once told me," Lord Sinclair began, taking a step closer with uncharacteristic hesitation, "that his greatest regret was knowing he would not live to see you claim your rightful place in society, not as a decorative ornament valued for beauty or dowry, but as a woman of substance recognized for her character and intellect." His voice had taken on a quality Charlotte had never heard before, a warmth that transformed his usual precise diction into something more intimate and unguarded. He would have been immensely proud tonight, though perhaps not surprised. He saw in you what took me longer to recognize, a strength that has nothing to do with power or position, but with an unwavering moral compass and genuine concern for others. Charlotte felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the undisguised admiration in his words, at the way his customary formality had given way to personal sentiment that seemed to surprise him as much as it affected her. They stood facing each other in the quiet room, the muffled sounds of the continuing ball providing a distant backdrop to the more immediate reality of this moment of transition, not just in Charlotte's social and financial circumstances, but in whatever undefined connection had been forming between them through their months of shared purpose. The Marquis closed the remaining distance between them with deliberate steps, his gaze never leaving hers as he reached for her hand with a gentleness that belied his imposing stature. "I came into your life as your father's representative, bound by duty and friendship to fulfill his wishes," he said, his deep voice pitched low enough that Charlotte had to lean slightly forward to catch his words. "I could not have anticipated how profoundly that duty would affect me personally, how my admiration for Edward Pembroke's daughter would transform from respect into something far more complicated and powerful." Charlotte's heart quickened at the naked vulnerability in his expression, so at odds with the controlled public persona he maintained so rigorously. "Complicated," she echoed softly, allowing herself to acknowledge the unspoken current that had been building between them for weeks. The moments of connection that had nothing to do with ledgers or legal strategies, and everything to do with recognition of a kindred spirit across the social divide that should have kept them firmly in separate spheres. Lord Sinclair's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around hers as he smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his austere features and hinted at the man beneath the carefully constructed facade of the formidable Marquess of Ravenwood. "I find myself in the unexpected position," he continued with careful precision, "of having fulfilled my promise to your father while simultaneously developing hopes and aspirations entirely my own. Hopes that would be presumptuous to express fully on this evening of already significant changes." Charlotte felt a surge of boldness born from the night's victory and the months of growing mutual understanding that had preceded it. "Perhaps," she suggested, meeting his gaze directly, "after such a public demonstration of our capacity for careful planning and strategic patience, we might allow ourselves one small moment of presumption." Something flared in Lord Sinclair's eyes at her words. Surprise, admiration, and unmistakable desire, momentarily unguarded before he mastered himself again, though his voice remained lower and more intimate than she had ever heard it. "Your courage continues to impress me, Lady Charlotte," he said, formally but with an underlying warmth that belied the address. "When the immediate consequences of tonight have settled, and you have had time to adjust to your new position, I hope you will permit me to call upon you, not as your father's representative or your legal advisor, but as a man who has come to value your company far beyond the requirements of duty." The smile that curved Charlotte's lips held both acknowledgement of their shared understanding and anticipation of possibilities that had seemed unimaginable mere months before, when she had stood alone in a small cottage at the edge of what had once been her home, clutching a brass key and a father's final letter. The weeks following the Harrington ball witnessed a remarkable transformation in Charlotte's circumstances as the legal machinery set in motion that night methodically restored her rightful position within both the Pembroke estate and London society. The cottage at the edge of Northcrest was exchanged for the main house itself, though Charlotte chose to retain her modest London apartment until the transition was complete, finding its familiar simplicity a comforting anchor amid the whirlwind of change. Frederick and Thomas had retreated to the continent in disgrace, their hasty departure fueled by the dual pressures of legal consequences and social ostracism, a fate Sophia had narrowly escaped through her swift disassociation and calculated displays of shocked innocence. The restitution process for families harmed by her brother's schemes progressed under Charlotte's compassionate but firm oversight. Her insistence on fair compensation, tempered by her equally strong commitment to preserving enough of the estate to maintain the charitable foundations her father had valued. Throughout this complex period of adjustment, Lord Sinclair remained a steadfast presence, his legal and social guidance invaluable, though he maintained a careful professional distance in public settings, mindful of Charlotte's need to establish her authority in her own right, rather than as an extension of his influence. By early autumn, the most pressing legal matters had been resolved, allowing Charlotte to begin focusing on longer-term plans for revitalizing the Pembroke legacy beyond the necessary damage control of the immediate aftermath. She had retained much of her father's loyal staff, who had been dismissed by Frederick, including the elderly head gardener whose careful tending had preserved the Duke's beloved rose garden despite her brother's indifference. On a crisp October morning, Charlotte was inspecting the newly restored east wing of Northcrest when Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper, arrived with news that Lord Sinclair had called unexpectedly and awaited her in the library. This departure from his usual practice of sending formal notice before visits sent a flutter of anticipation through Charlotte as she made her way through the familiar corridors, noting with satisfaction the gradual restoration of the house's former dignity under her stewardship, family portraits rehung, heirloom furniture retrieved from storage, surfaces polished to a warm glow that spoke of care rather than ostentation. Lord Sinclair stood by the library window when she entered, his tall figure outlined against the autumn sunlight that streamed through the leaded glass, turning the room's oak paneling to burnished gold. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and Charlotte was struck by the unusual informality of his appearance, his riding clothes suggesting he had come directly from exercising his horse, his hair slightly tousled by the wind, his expression more open than she had ever seen it in daylight hours. "Forgive the unexpected intrusion," he began, forgoing the usual formal greetings as he crossed the room toward her with purposeful strides. "I found I could not properly express what I wished to say in a letter, nor could I wait for a more conventional appointment." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken at the barely contained energy in his movements, so different from his customary measured control. Something significant had shifted in him, something that had apparently required immediate expression rather than diplomatic patience, and she found herself responding to his urgency with an answering alertness, her senses heightened by the unusual spontaneity of the moment. "When we first met," Lord Sinclair said without preamble, coming to stand before her with an intensity that seemed to diminish the space between them despite their proper distance, "I saw you as my friend's daughter, a worthy cause, a responsibility I had accepted out of respect for your father." His direct gaze held hers with unflinching honesty as he continued, "Working alongside you these past months has transformed that initial impression beyond recognition. I have watched you face adversity with grace, navigate complex legal challenges with intelligence, and extend compassion to those harmed by your brothers, when vindictiveness would have been entirely justified." His voice deepened with emotion as he added, "I have come to admire not just your character but your company, your perspectives, your quiet humor, your capacity for seeing beauty and possibility where others might see only problems to be solved." Charlotte stood motionless, scarcely breathing as Lord Sinclair, Nathaniel as she had come to think of him in the privacy of her thoughts, took a small step closer, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that she had come to associate with his presence during their long strategy sessions in her London study. "I promised myself I would wait until your position was secure, until your legal standing was beyond question. Before speaking of personal matters, he said, a rare uncertainty threading through his usually confident tone. But I find myself increasingly unable to maintain the formal distance that propriety dictates, particularly when that distance no longer reflects the truth of my feelings. With deliberate care he reached for her hand, holding it between both of his in a gesture that bridged the gap between proper respect and intimate connection. "Charlotte," he said, using her given name for the first time without her title, the sound of it in his voice sending a shiver of recognition through her. "I came here today to ask if you might consider a different kind of partnership than the one we have shared thus far. Not one of legal strategy or social navigation, but of shared life and purpose." His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around hers as he continued, "Your father once told me he hoped you would find someone who valued your mind as much as society might value more superficial attributes. I find myself hoping that I might be that person, that you might consider me not just as your father's friend or your legal advisor, but as a man who has grown to love you for precisely the qualities others failed to see." The word love hung in the sun-dappled air between them, transforming the library from a formal setting into an intimate space containing just the two of them and this pivotal moment of vulnerability and possibility, as Charlotte's carefully maintained composure finally yielded to the smile she could no longer contain, a smile that answered his question before she found the words to express her own journey from dutiful alliance to something far deeper and more profound. Spring had returned to Northcrest with vibrant renewal, the estate's formal gardens bursting with colour under Charlotte's attentive restoration, while inside the main house, final preparations were underway for the afternoon's ceremony. 1 year had passed since the fateful Harrington ball that had altered the course of the Pembroke legacy, a year of careful rebuilding and thoughtful transformation that had gradually replaced scandal with respect in London's collective memory. Charlotte stood at her father's desk in the study, now her study, reviewing correspondence from the solicitors handling the last of the restitution cases, her simple yet elegant emerald gown catching the morning light as she made final notations with steady hands adorned only by a single ring, a magnificent emerald surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to generations of Sinclair brides. The Duchess of Ravenwood, as she had been known since her winter wedding 3 months prior, paused in her work to gaze out at the rose garden where workers were arranging chairs for the afternoon's gathering. Not a social spectacle designed to impress society, but a meaningful ceremony to formally establish the Pembroke Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting families affected by financial misconduct and providing Educate, high on to protect vulnerable individuals from similar schemes in the future. Nathaniel found her there moments later, entering the study with the comfortable familiarity of a man at home, though he still carried himself with the inherent dignity that had first impressed her during their initial meeting at the cottage. Marriage had softened some of his formality and private, revealing layers of warmth and unexpected playfulness beneath his public reserve. Yet he remained the commanding presence whose unwavering support had helped her weather the storms of the past year. "The last of the guests have confirmed their attendance," he informed her, crossing to stand behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders in a gesture of affection that had become natural between them. "Including Lady Winters and her granddaughter, the first recipients of the Foundation's educational scholarship." Charlotte covered his hand with her own, their fingers intertwining in wordless communication of shared satisfaction. The Foundation represented the culmination of their vision for transforming the Pembroke inheritance from a source of privilege into a force for positive change, honoring Edward's values while creating something entirely new from the ashes of his son's misdeeds. "I found something this morning that I thought you should see before the ceremony," Nathaniel said, producing a small weathered journal from his coat pocket and placing it gently before her on the desk. "It was among your father's personal effects that were transferred to my London residence for safekeeping, one I hadn't discovered until now." Charlotte opened the faded leather cover with reverent care to find her father's distinctive handwriting, the journal dating from shortly after her mother's death, when Charlotte was just an infant. The entries chronicled Edward's early observations of his daughter, his growing recognition of her intelligence and character, even as a small child, his private concerns about his son's developing traits, and most movingly, his hopes for Charlotte's future happiness. Tears welled in her eyes as she read his final entry, dated just weeks before his death. "I have arranged what protection I can for Charlotte's inheritance, both material and moral. Lord Sinclair will guide her through the legal challenges, but I hope even, that he may eventually see in her what I have always known, that she possesses a strength of character and clarity of purpose that would complement his own admirable qualities. My greatest regret in leaving this world is that I will not witness the woman she will become, but I depart with the conviction that she alone truly understands the worth of the Pembroke name beyond its gold." Nathaniel's hand tightened gently on her shoulder as Charlotte closed the journal, its pages having confirmed what she had always felt in her heart, that her father had seen her true worth long before society's validation or even her own confidence had solidified. "He would be proud of what you've accomplished," Nathaniel said softly, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not just in reclaiming your rightful place or restoring the family's reputation, but in transforming adversity into opportunity for others." Charlotte rose to face her husband, finding in his steady gaze the same unwavering belief in her that had first drawn them together across social conventions and formal constraints. Their partnership had evolved from strategic alliance to profound connection, built on shared values and mutual respect that had deepened into love. A love neither had expected to find amid the complications of duty and justice, yet which had flourished precisely because of the challenges they had navigated together. As they walked arm in arm toward the garden where guests would soon gather to witness the foundation's inauguration, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her from the isolated cottage to this moment of purpose and fulfillment. The Pembroke name had been restored not to its former glory of mere wealth and status, but to something far more meaningful, a legacy of integrity and service that honored her father's true values while creating her own path forward. The brothers who had fought so desperately for gold had ultimately lost everything of real worth, while she, in fighting for the intangible inheritance of principle and honor, had gained more than she could have imagined: respect, purpose, love, and the opportunity to transform a personal victory into a broader benefit for others. As Charlotte took her place at the podium overlooking the gathered guests, Nathaniel standing proudly at her side, she felt her father's presence as tangibly as the spring breeze that stirred the roses he had loved. Roses that now bloomed more vibrantly than ever under her care, their beauty a testament to the enduring power of nurturing what truly matters beyond material wealth. Dear listener, as our story of Lady Charlotte draws to a close, perhaps we might carry forward a truth that the Pembroke legacy illuminates so clearly in our own lives, that the inheritance of greatest value is rarely counted in gold or property, but in the principles we choose to honor, the integrity we maintain when tested, and the courage to stand for what is right, even when standing alone. Like Charlotte, we may find ourselves underestimated or overlooked, our true worth invisible to those who measure value only in superficial terms. Yet it is precisely in these moments of being unseen that our character is most critically formed, not by external validation, but by the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. The gold of reputation, of social standing, even of material wealth may tarnish or be stolen away, but the legacy of who we truly are, the name we build through consistent acts of courage, kindness and principle, this is the inheritance that neither time nor circumstance can diminish. May you, like Charlotte, discover that in fighting for what truly matters beyond the glitter of gold, you claim a legacy far richer than anything that can be held in mere hands.